been part of the idea of the middle income trap. So let's lay that concept out. And I know that the WDR 24 has some very, I would say, relevant and newer pathways that you've recommended for countries to adopt, given the churn that you were referring to. But let's start with the middle income trap, and then we'll maybe get into some of the recommendations of it.
So the middle income trap, Anirudh, was an idea that we stumbled upon actually. So this was when Homi Kharas and Homi was my boss at the time. He was chief economist for East Asia, a really great thinker actually. So he and I were working on a report along with our team on East Asia. This was East Asia about 10 years after the crisis that East Asia had in the 1990s. And East Asia had been transformed because back then Japan, I think during the crisis or before the crisis, Japan was the glue that held the region together. By the time we wrote this book, it was China, but the main concern that a lot of countries like Indonesia and China and Vietnam and others had was that they felt that increasingly when they looked at their structures, they looked more like the structures of Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, rather than those of Japan and Korea and Taiwan and so on. And so they were worried. Sorry?
In what way were their structures more similar to the Latin American counterparts?
So, for example, they were very worried about inequality. They felt there was a rising amount of inequality in their countries, which Japan and Korea and all did not have. They were also worried about whether or not they could replicate the same strategies, especially China, right? Because you actually had that these countries all exported their way out. They exported their way out of underdevelopment. But they also had policies that we would actually now call industrial policy. But they were lucky in the sense that they had a competitive world environment in which they could see whether or not their industrial policy was working or not. Because the economic activities that they were encouraging at home could be tested in terms of whether or not these were the right things in a competitive economic environment. And I think that all of these countries started to worry a little bit about those kind of things. I mean, I can tell you more about that, but essentially what happened was that we then tried to sort of take a look to sort of see if that was indeed true. And the thing that we sort of saw was that actually Latin American countries did actually do very well in terms of economic growth and structural change and so on until about the early 70s. And then after that, you found that their per capita incomes had not really grown for the next 3 decades. In fact, in some cases, they had grown a bit and then gone back, and they had a debt crisis and all of these things. So that was what they were worried about. And so what we started to sort of look was to sort of see whether or not is it that they actually stopped doing some of the things that the Koreas and the Japans and all had done. And the answer, broadly speaking, is yes. Okay, I think many of these countries tended to have import substitution strategies, broadly speaking. And those import substitution strategies were usually accompanied by a huge push on subsidies for innovation at home, trying to develop technologies that you actually basically wanted homegrown technologies and so on. The classic case of this was Brazil, of course, And once you start to sort of get into that, those are the antecedents essentially of the 3I framework that we have in the 2024 World Development Report. But to sort of go back a little bit, so that was back in 2006 or something like that. So now fast forward 20 years, and we found that this whole term about the middle income trap was actually talked about a lot, but actually we found that there wasn't a clear sense of what kind of a framework should be applied in middle income countries. We thought they were different from low income countries that would rely largely just on accelerating investment, and upper income countries, high income countries, where of course innovation was an important part of a growth or development strategy because these countries were close to the world technology frontier. In between, there were these middle income countries, and then the question was, is there a good framework for them? What that World Development Report tries to do is provide that framework. And just by the way, it's very difficult to provide a framework for countries that now host about 6 billion people. So you have a lot of heterogeneity between these countries.